So I've now loaded up a potential axe file. The thing to note here is that I'm going to assume that this is complete. Obviously, I know it isn't ultimately because there's 2 weeks to go or 3 weeks, and the student that's done this will naturally be working on this additionally to improve it. So in many ways, I'll be pointing out errors and potential problems, but arguably those possibly could have been resolved anyway. But regardless, let's just assume that this is the finished piece, and ultimately we're at the stage where we need to unwrap and bake. So the one on the left is our low poly, and the one on the right is indeed our high poly. So the thing to note, I'm just going to go through what I feel is incorrect with the file, but this isn't an indictment of the students' inability to understand what's going on. This is more to do with everyone learning and just assuming that these fixes would have been fixed anyway. So try and treat this file as almost being it's been given to me to try and find out what's wrong with it and give some hints and tips in terms of how to correct. So firstly, what I would say is, in terms of the grid size, things are good. I would try and keep things relatively central. So although that one's central there, the high poly, but ultimately, I tend to work things in directly in this location, and also remember that if I'm looking at this from the front view, then really I shouldn't see this because this is essentially like the bottom view or the side view. It looks like the bottom view. So essentially, we know our front view should in fact be this. That's what our front view should in fact be. And obviously our top view now is going to be correct, and our perspective view. We want to be thinking about things in terms of, if I was to hold this axe in front of me, and essentially this is my eye view, and this is how I'm going to go about looking at things. So try and orientate your actual asset correctly in the first place as well. So I'll just undo a few steps, because in the process of rotating that, the two seem to have a big offset. So I'm just going to group that, Control G. Now I'm just going to rotate that around to what it should be. Confirm that is 90 degrees, that's good. So first port of call before I do anything else is delete all the history on there. I don't know what's going on with it because I didn't make it, I suppose. It may well be that the history's been frozen or history's been deleted and the transformations have also been frozen, but we'll do it again anyway. Let's save. So freeze transformations. Let's have a quick look in the outliner to find out what's going on. Potentially there could be additional files in there that we don't necessarily need. So we have everything in there at the moment because I essentially grouped it. And we've just got a gigantic, huge number of assets as well, and clearly, that's our low poly. But our current naming convention is totally incorrect as well, so that all needs to be fixed as well. So what we're better off doing now is, this one's been split into individual components, which is the right way to go about things, and this one is one solid block, so it's not going to bake correctly as it stands at the moment because the naming and the separation of the mesh hasn't actually been done. So let's just, for the time being, we'll assume our high poly is slightly okay, and we're just going to hide that. We're going to have a look at the low poly and try and find out what's right and what's wrong with that, and then we'll try and cross-reference our high poly and check that to see what's right and wrong, and then we'll have a look at the unwrap process. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my low poly over here, and I'm just going to try and move that out of the group. So that's going to be our low poly. We can hide our high poly now as well, and let's put this in world space center. In the long run, you don't want to be having a high poly and low poly in different locations. That's always going to cause a problem later on down the line in terms of baking or whatnot. You do need to make sure that these are bang on in the correct location in relation to each other. You can always move them afterwards and try and snap by a common vert. But in the long run, I'd probably suggest that you don't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily separate things off. It's just one less step to worry about, especially when you've got something which is vastly complex. So I'm just going to go back to my low poly, and I'm going to move this into World Space Center. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the grid line to snap that into place. So we'll hide our high poly. Got our low poly selected. Pivot point, we'll make sure that's good to go. So I'm just going to go center the pivot point, and then I'm going to just press W to translate, and X should allow me to snap to the grid points. So that there now, it's okay. I mean, you can always move it above the grid if you want to keep the grid there, or you can hide the grid entirely. Choice entirely yours. But the main thing is it's now in world space center now, which is going to be useful for us. So it's all one gigantic block at the moment. That's going to cause problems in the long run. So we need to split this off. Shift right click and separate. So let's now have a look at what's going on. So in the process of separating, it's done something really weird in that some components it's separated off. You know, these are now separate, which is what we want. That's now separate. But if you notice this one, you can see here it's separated each individual vert. So that suggests each poly. So that's suggesting something wasn't quite right with that particular mesh component, which makes no sense to me. Again, I didn't model it, so I'm not quite sure how that's happened, but we should need to fix that obviously. So I'm just going to select all that. I'm just going to combine those particular polys, and then I'm just going to select all the verts and merge those as well. I'm going to confirm things are good with that. I'm just going to select one poly there, for example, and just move that up, and now it's saying that everything's good. So that's okay. Let's confirm that hasn't happened elsewhere. Looks like we're okay. So I'll start with the bottom and we'll take it from there. So the first thing to note is, you know, the smoothing groups are currently incorrect as well. So they're correct at this, in this case over here, but then obviously down here they're all incorrect. So what we should do in the first instance is just select everything and literally just go soft hard and give it a few moments to do its thing. That'll fix the majority of the issues, yeah. Inevitably there will be problems because you can see here, for example, it's thrown a slight hissy fit in terms of the angle for the hard and soft edges, but that's something we'll fix in a few moments. So what I will do is select everything again, and I'm just going to make sure toggle soft edge displays on, and that will give me a visual indication of what's incorrect. So clearly we can see now that these two should be hard edge, and inevitably there will be, potentially anyway. Oh no, that was the only one, which is a bit weird. So we've got these three edges, and we just need to make sure those are set to hard. And again, just click off, make sure that's good. Yeah, that's okay. So what I'd probably say here is that, in my opinion, I think this is a bit too low poly, and that can potentially cause problems in the long run. We'll confirm that when we do our bakes as such. We can clearly see that, you know, there's smoothing group issues in relation to this. You can see some of these edges hard, such as that one over there. Or maybe, in fact, it's not. It's actually my my display that's actually causing that, not necessarily the actual Maya as such. And that's down to the fact that I've got a 4K monitor and sorry, 4K television, and it's not actually a monitor, so when it displays, you know, text and very thin edges, it doesn't do a fantastic job of them. So just to play it safe, I am going to select those two and literally just go soften edge. Yeah, in fact it actually was, yeah, there were hard edges when there shouldn't be, so I just made all those soft. So that one's okay, that one's okay. Just slightly too low poly in my opinion, but you know, we can live with that. That's nice and clean, that's good. Let's now just attach these components together as well. In fact, what we'll do is we'll do the attachments right at the end. For the time being, we'll just check the mesh to make sure things are good and there's nothing wasteful going on. That's okay. I'm going to just temporarily just move this. In fact, I'll just delete it. Actually, it's actually quicker to delete than it is to move it, especially when the pivot point's elsewhere. All I've done that for is purely just to get an idea of what's going on underneath these particular sections to make sure there's nothing untoward going on. Press undo a couple of times and I'm back in. So that's okay. These are nice and optimized, so not really concerned about that. I'd probably say in the long run that it might be worthwhile, just every other edge, for example these edges over here, you can probably delete them, and that would make it more optimal. And because it's a repetitive component, reduction of just those two edges multiplied by, you know, numerous times, because there's obviously a lot of bolts, would have a significant impact on the overall try count. So that's food for thought, and certainly something I would consider, but I won't do it for every single one. Right, that's okay. Whiz along, find out what's going up here. Yep, that's cool, that's cool. Good, good, good. Make sure that that smoothing issue isn't prevalent on this particular component as well. Okay, that's okay. Again, let's look at the top component over here to make sure the smoothing is indeed correct. Or the hard and soft edges again, sorry, I keep saying smoothing. Right, let's confirm, yeah, that's good, so that's nice and good. Okay, that's nice and low poly. I'll just quickly centralize a pivot point over here. I just move this across to make sure there isn't a wasteful poly at the top and the bottom. There isn't, so that's a good sign. So the student has taken time to make sure that wasted edges have been removed. So I'm assuming the student wants to bake across the indentation onto the low poly. That's fine. That's fine. So a slight interpretation of slightly different interpretation, should I say, of what the axe head is doing at this point over here. It's not necessarily incorrect, but it's something to consider in terms of how closely it matches the reference. The other thing to note is, surely at this point over here, this particular row of polys, in my opinion, is too thin. The reason being is because in the real world, if it was an axe, then naturally it's not going to be that. It's more likely to be, quite thin, like so, yeah. Because the idea is going to chop an orc's head off, presumably. So let's just undo that. Again, I don't want to make those fixes because inevitably, if I make that fix, then the high poly, I'd have to go back in there and change all that. All I'm doing is pointing out all the issues for consideration and where you would need to go back and make that appropriate fix. So aside from that low poly perspective, that will do. It's got some nice detail in there, nice little nick there would help. Obviously, it's been done on the other side as well, so it's something to consider. Maybe pop one in here later on, just to vary the actual components. So something a bit weird going on over here. Just going to press delete on that and make sure that things are good there. That's okay. That's okay. So it could be a potential, I nearly said smooth group, issue with the hard and soft edges over here. Purely because we've got this scenario going on, I'm quite sure what that is yet. So what I am going to do is, I'm going to play it ultra safe. Before we do anything else, I'm just going to make sure all the individual verts have been welded together. So I've selected everything. I'm going to press F8 to go into component mode, and that will allow me to select every single vertex and then merge verts which are closely together. So I'm going to click on merge verts, and my threshold is quite low, but I can always make it even lower by pressing another 0 on there. In fact, it doesn't let me because I think that's a maximum it will do, but that's okay. And that's just going to make sure there's nothing like multiple verts going on top of each other. I think now we probably need to go around and start naming some of this as well. That will do. Okay, so now we need to start grouping things together, and we need to start grouping things using our understanding of the fact that we need to have mesh name baking done within Substance Painter, and any components that sit directly on top of each other need to be separated off by a mesh name. But clearly that there and that there sit on top of each other, so these bolts would have to be separated off with a separate mesh name _LP_HP in relation to this particular shaft component. So let's just now select all the bolts. Might be worthwhile just doing this from the front view. Press F. I press 5 to show my wireframe as well. I'm just going to select all these and then deselect bits I don't need. Deselect them. And again, just confirm that what I have selected is indeed all the bolts. Just move them across and press undo. Yes, that's good. So I'm going to shift and combine those together. So what I'll do is I'll hide those now, just so we can do things slowly but surely. So all these pattern sections, again, we'll treat those as a separate mesh. We can't attach them to that in terms of naming. They need to be detached for the purpose of the baking. So what I'm going to do is select everything, deselect, so we've just got those components there. Apply the same principle again. So Daisy, just going to go in front mode. Apply the same principle. Add all these and then start deselecting. And again, just move that across to make sure that I have just all those components. Yes, I do. And then I'm going to combine those together as well. I'll press Control S as well, just to save that file. Hide that with H. So that's one big block. That's fine. Arguably, these can be attached to that. So I'm going to combine those two together. So essentially we've got 3 components at the moment. I'll hide that. We have all these pattern sections, so I'm just going to select everything. Again, just deselect the bits I don't need. So as I said previously, for the purpose of the baking, we can't have objects which are connected to each other or intersect to each other as part of the same mesh name. They need to be detached, so these can be combined together. And then ultimately, there's a big enough gap between these two, so these can essentially just be the same as well. So I just want to hide these bits we fixed, and then in this case the axe is one big block, so that's fine, and arguably these can all just be one component as well. Combine those together as well. So think about it in terms of there's no need to produce 5,000 individual components with individual mesh names. We can actually do things in a more simple way by thinking ahead in terms of how the baking works within Substance Painter, and how we can reduce the number of mesh names that we need. That's good to go. Let's just unhide everything. We've obviously still got our high poly one over there. We'll worry about that later. Just hide that again. And because I've made some changes, I'm going to delete all the history again. And then I'm going to press Ctrl G, and I'm going to call this LP. So we're in the process of essentially tidying our file up now. We'll rename this to HP. And again, I'll just save it just in case. So from a mesh naming perspective, it's good to go. The next step is essentially think about how we're going to unwrap this. So what I would suggest to you is there is no need to unwrap repetitive components, because it can be very time consuming. So I'm assuming that all these patterns are the same all the way around. So again, no need to unwrap every single one. Why not unwrap one and then essentially duplicate it? So now we're at a stage where we're going to think about modularity and how to ease the workload. So what we'll do is we'll select all the repetitive components and delete them. Unwrap the one unique component, such as that, and then essentially just duplicate that around to produce the rest. I'm just going to select these sections over here. Just going to press F, and then again just delete those as well. So we can approach the axe in 2 different ways. One way is to essentially have both sides of the axe within the unwrap, so that will give us unique UV shells for each, and as such there won't be any repetition, no overlapping, and you'll end up with a more unique look. The only downside to that is it will impact the overall texel rate, because essentially you've got more polygons you're going to have to put in there. So for the purpose of this, I'm not going to remove it. I'm just going to leave that in there. But I would recommend that you essentially unwrap one side and then texture it, and then afterwards, once it's all textured, duplicate this from a mesh perspective and mirror it across. So there's some additional repetitive components over here, so let's also remove them. So delete them. I'm going to assume that obviously this side is the same as the other side as well. So we can chuck one of these, one side of here. So I'm just going to go top view and then just select those particular components. And to play it safe, again, just move them across to make sure that I'm not deleting anything else. So press delete on that as well. So now I've tried to reduce the amount of independent UVs which I need to create. So again, I'll just save this file at this point. So the next step after this basic cleanup, inevitably we are going to have to go back. Just remember that we are going to have to go back and make some fixes to the naming conventions, and obviously we've also deleted a lot of things, so we're going to have to duplicate them and rename them, etc, etc. But the next step now is essentially pop it into the unwrap and take it from there.